How ancient people started fire without matches. There were no matches, no lighters, and no gas stoves. Yet ancient people could make fire whenever they needed it. How? Fire was one of the most important parts of ancient life. It provided warmth during cold nights. It helped people cook food. It gave light after sunset. It could protect a settlement from wild animals. But keeping a fire burning all the time was not always easy. If the fire went out, people needed another way to create it. Ancient people discovered several methods. One of the simplest methods involved friction. Dry wood could be rubbed against another piece of wood. The movement created heat. With enough friction, the wood began producing hot dust and tiny glowing embers. Those embers could then be placed into dry grass, bark, leaves, or other easily burning material. The material was gently blown until it began to burn. The process required patience. The wood had to be dry, the friction had to be strong enough, and the person had to keep the hot ember alive before it disappeared. Different communities developed different versions of this technique. One method used a wooden stick rotated rapidly against another piece of wood. The rotating stick created heat at the contact point. Another method used a bow-like tool to rotate the wooden spindle faster. This allowed the person to maintain friction for longer. The basic tools were simple: wood, string, dry plant material, human effort, but the technique required skill. Ancient people learned which types of wood worked best. They learned how dry the material needed to be. They learned how much pressure to apply, and they learned how to protect the tiny ember from wind. Another method used stone. Certain stones can produce sparks when struck against suitable hard materials. Ancient people learned to control these sparks. A spark by itself is tiny. It disappears almost immediately, so it needed to land on something capable of catching the spark. Dry fibers and other fine materials could help. Once a tiny ember appeared, it could be transferred to a bundle of dry material. The person then carefully fed the ember with air. Slowly, the ember could become a flame. This made fire starting a combination of several skills. Creating the spark was only the first step. Catching it was another, keeping the ember alive was another, and turning it into a flame required careful control. Ancient people had to understand these steps through experience. There were no instruction manuals, no matches waiting in a box, no lighter to produce a flame instantly. Fire had to be created from the materials around them, and the next part of the process was just as important as making the first spark. Because without the right material, even a perfect spark could die. A spark needed something dry enough to catch it. Ancient people used natural materials for this purpose. Dry grass, tree bark, fine plant fibers, wood shavings, and other lightweight materials could catch heat more easily than thick pieces of wood. These materials were often prepared before the fire was needed. A small bundle of dry fibers could be kept in a protected place. When a spark or ember appeared, it could be placed inside the bundle. The person then blew gently into it. Air helped the ember grow. A faint glow could become smoke. The smoke could become a small flame, and the small flame could finally be transferred to larger pieces of dry wood. Building a fire was therefore a gradual process. Ancient people didn't simply create a large flame instantly. They started with the smallest source of heat and carefully increased it. First came the spark or ember, then the dry fibers, then small twigs, then larger pieces of wood. This arrangement allowed the fire to grow without being smothered. Friction methods also required careful preparation. The wood needed to be dry, the surface had to create enough friction. The spindle had to move repeatedly, and the person had to maintain the right pressure and speed. A bow drill made this easier. A wooden spindle was placed against another piece of wood. A cord connected to a simple bow was wrapped around the spindle. Moving the bow back and forth rotated the spindle rapidly. The friction produced heat at the bottom. Eventually, hot wood dust and an ember could form. The ember was then transferred to dry tinder. This technique required practice. A beginner could easily move too slowly. Too much pressure could stop the movement. Damp wood could make the process much harder. Experienced firemakers learned to recognize the right conditions. Stone-based firemaking had its own challenges. Different stones behaved differently. Ancient people learned through experience which materials could produce useful sparks. The sparks were directed toward dry tinder. The tinder had to be prepared carefully. If it was damp, the spark might disappear. If it was too coarse, it might not catch enough heat. So firemaking depended not only on the tool, it depended on preparation. Ancient people also learned how to preserve fire. Instead of starting a new fire every time, they could keep glowing embers alive. Hot coals could remain under ash and be protected from wind. Later, the embers could be uncovered and used to restart a flame. This was especially useful during travel. Carrying a living ember could be easier than creating a new fire from nothing. Fire became deeply connected to ancient daily life. People cooked food over it, they warmed themselves around it, they used it to harden certain wooden tools, they worked with clay near it, they used controlled fire to process materials, and at night, fire created a small area of light in an otherwise dark world. The ability to create fire gave ancient communities much greater control over their environment. But the methods were simple: wood, stone, dry grass, plant fibers, a little patience, and knowledge passed from one generation to another. There were no matches, no lighters, no electricity. Yet ancient people learned how to turn friction and sparks into one of the most important tools in human history. And once they mastered fire, it became much more than a source of warmth. It became a technology.